Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I am Laura Stack, your host and also the CEO and founder of Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens on the dangers of adolescent marijuana use on brain development, psychosis, and suicide. And we have a wonderful guest with us today, whom I will introduce in just a moment, Professor Mary Cannon, after we go over a couple very brief logistics. This session is being recorded. We will be doing a couple polls as we go, so be on your toes and ready to click on your screen and answer those polls for us. If we have time at the end, hopefully we will have a few minutes. Professor Cannon will be taking your questions, so please type those into the question box as we go, and I will read them off in the order they are received. If we run out of time, we have a hard stop at the top of the hour. I will email any leftover questions over to Mary for private response. There is a handout in the handout box, which you can download and print if you wish. There are a PDF version of her slides with notes, or you can get those on this URL, on this page, if you are watching the recording. So without any further ado, I will introduce Professor Mary Cannon, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry, RCSI, University of Medicine and Health Sciences in Dublin, Ireland. She also works as a consultant psychiatrist at Beaumont Hospital, Dublin. Professor Cannon currently holds a Consolidator Award from the European Research Council to investigate the meanings and mechanisms of psychotic experiences in young people. Her longstanding research interest is in the area of childhood and adolescent risk and protective factors. She has served on 2 Irish governmental task forces on youth mental health and on substance use in third-level education. And she is the chair of the academic faculty of the College of Psychiatrists in Ireland and vice chair of the Youth and Student Mental Health Special Interest Group. Mary, thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you, Laura. It's an absolute honor to be here. And I have great admiration for the work that you and your group are doing. I was asked to talk today about cannabis myths and legends, or sorry, myths and facts. And I would like to just give you a little background first as to how I got into the area of cannabis and interest in cannabis, because as you can see from
my your slide, Mary,
that's fine.
Do a quick click on the slide itself. Yeah. There you go. Okay. Now you can advance.
Yeah. Okay, well, as I say, I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm actually an adult psychiatrist, which means I see young people from the age of 18 upwards. But I suppose it's a long time since I've realized that actually we can't look at adult psychiatry in isolation, because everyone is, we are one person all through life. So what happens in childhood affects very much the risk of mental illness in adulthood. So we have to take a developmental approach to mental illness, and that's why I've always been very interested in childhood and adolescence. And I have been doing some work for many years on the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, which is a longitudinal cohort study in the South Island of New Zealand of 1,000 children. And I was studying risk factors for schizophrenia in this cohort. And also I was looking at the psychotic symptoms, prevalence of psychotic symptoms in young people. And work from this study has shown that 75% of mental illness actually begins before the age of 18, so which highlights the importance of looking at the childhood and adolescent period. So which we need to look at prevention, and I think psychiatry needs to move more into this area, such as oncology does. We all know that you need to move in early with cancer. You need to find it. That's why we screen for it, and the results are much better if you move in early than if you wait until something has spread. So in psychiatry, I mean, or in all of medicine, we have 3 models of prevention. Tertiary prevention is where you have good services for people who have developed a disorder, and you try and make them try and help people to recover and to stay well. And then secondary prevention is where you develop services for people who are on the brink of developing a disorder, and we call these in psychosis as the at-risk mental state clinics that have been developed in many areas around the world, such as Australia and some in the US also, and in Europe. But I suppose where psychiatry falls down a little is in the area of primary prevention, which is stopping the illness developing in the first place. So this means you identify risk factors and you try and reduce the level of risk factors, and also identify protective factors and try and increase that level. So it's a balance between risk and protective factors all the time. And I suppose this is why talking about my work in the Dunedin cohort, I was looking at psychotic symptoms in young children. These are age 11. And we found that if a young child had reported a psychotic symptom at age 11, they were much more likely to develop a schizophrenia or schizophreniform illness later in life, in their mid-20s, almost 16 times higher. And even if they had vague psychotic symptoms. So this was an area that I've been very interested in for many years. But around the time I was looking at this, or a little before the time I was looking at this, a study came through from a conscript study from Sweden, where Sven Andreasson and his group had found a very interesting finding, where young conscripts had been interviewed at the age of 18 when they were just joining the army, and they were able to follow them up over many years using national registers in Sweden. And they found that if a young man at age 18 had said that he had smoked cannabis more than 50 times by his 18th birthday, that he was much more likely to develop a schizophrenic illness later in life. Now, and there seemed to be a dose-response effect in this, but it was particularly among the heavy adolescent users. Now, this finding was very intriguing for everyone, but people were dismissing it in terms of, oh, well, these young people were already developing psychosis, and that's why they were using cannabis. So that they couldn't answer that question from the Swedish study. But what Robin Murray, who was my PhD supervisor at the time, said that I should go and work with Louise Arsenault and Temi Moffat and Lavshan Caspi, who were also doing work in this Dunedin cohort, and look at this exact question, because we had this information about psychotic symptoms at age 11. So Louise and I, we found that indeed there was a high risk that young people who smoked cannabis before the age of 15 had a 4-fold increased risk of a schizophrenia or schizophreniform disorder diagnosis at age 26. And even when you adjusted statistically for the psychotic symptoms at age 11, you still had an increased effect. So that kind of answered that question, if you like, showing that over and above, that the young people who used cannabis had a risk over and above any existing propensity to psychotic symptoms. And what we found was that that of the young people in the Dunedin cohort who used cannabis by age 15, 10% of them actually went on to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizophreniform disorder at age 26. The evidence began to mount up, so not just the Swedish study, but also studies from the Netherlands and from the UK, all showing the same thing, that an increased risk of psychosis following adolescent cannabis use. And these were risks of 2 to 3-fold. We had found 4-fold for this, the 15-year-olds. And then systematic reviews also pooled evidence from various studies, again showing approximately a 3-fold risk in young cannabis users of later psychotic disorder. And the population attributable fraction, this is the amount of the illness in the population that would be eliminated if you didn't have this risk factor, in this case cannabis, was estimated at somewhere between 7 and 13%. Now, all this work was being done around the early noughties, if you like, 2002, 2003, 2004. And it seemed like the story was quite, we knew the answers at this stage. And I moved out of the cannabis field, and except for one study, which I looked at later, showing an interaction between cannabis use and early childhood trauma and increasing risk of psychotic experiences. But apart from that, I didn't really look at cannabis for many years. But in the meantime, in the background, the potency was increasing. So from about 2007, 2008, 2009, cannabis began to change. And I'm sure all your listeners are aware that the THC component has become much more prominent in cannabis, up to 20% at this point, unlike the Woodstock weed, which is the girl in the corner, where it was about 2% or even less. And I suppose I really began to take an interest again when the findings of this study called the EU-GEI study were published. And this was an incidence study of first episode psychosis across 14 sites in Europe, a large study funded by the European Union. And so in each site, each country that took part, they had 2 sites. One was an urban site and one was a more rural site. And it covered UK and France, Spain, Italy, and Netherlands. And what they found, and Hannah Youngsma wrote up this paper and presented it, it was quite startling findings. 3 areas had quite dramatic increases in incidence compared to the other areas. And these were London, Amsterdam, and Paris. And this was published in 2018. And people were trying to think, what's going on in these regions? Is it to do with the fact they're a big city? But in fact, there are big cities like Madrid or Bologna who weren't showing this effect. And so what Marta Di Forti did, and she works with Robin Murray in London, she mapped the incidence of psychosis against the daily use, cannabis use in each area. And she found a remarkable similarity between these findings. So it seemed like that possibly the most reasonable explanation for this finding, this increased incidence in these areas, was rates of cannabis use. But it wasn't just any cannabis, it was the high potency cannabis. And this is from Marta's paper in Lancet Psychiatry, which has been very influential, showing that those who use high potency cannabis more than once a week have a 5-fold increased risk of later of psychosis. And these risks are also high in Amsterdam and in Paris. And in fact, again, they estimated this population attributable fraction. So if nobody smoked high potency cannabis in any of these areas, they estimated that 12% of all cases first episode psychosis across Europe would be prevented, 32% in London and 50% in Amsterdam. So you can see the population attributable fractions are higher than what I was talking about when I was first looking at it back in the early noughties. And also, incidence of psychosis is changing over time. We're already seeing increases in incidence of cannabis-induced psychosis in countries like Denmark, and who that are able to measure these things through good registers. And even in Portugal, where cannabis was decriminalised in 2001, rates of cannabis-induced psychosis have gone up. And this is a quite startling figure from Camberwell in South London, showing dramatic increases over time in incidence of schizophrenia. So, as I mentioned, I had been very interested in risk factors such as obstetric factors and childhood adversity, but really the most potent risk factor for schizophrenia or a psychotic illness at the moment is cannabis use, particularly high potency cannabis use. So in order to think about preventing mental illness and preventing psychosis, we need to look at cannabis, particularly cannabis use in youth. And this is where we come up to the first, I suppose, thing that had changed over the time when the period where I first was interested in cannabis use and then afterwards. What I noticed when I came back to the area to investigate it, that suddenly this idea that cannabis was a medicine had gained incredible popularity. And this I found quite baffling. I suppose being in Europe, this hadn't really come to the fore over here as it had obviously in the US, where you've been having this cannabis medical movement for quite a while. And the term medicine I find very puzzling when it comes to this idea of medical cannabis, because, and I suppose being from a medical background myself, getting a medicine to approved is a very complex and expensive process, and requires huge funds and a large R&D department. The product needs to be extensively investigated, and in many trials, huge trials, and then it needs to be regulated and needs to be carefully checked and monitored over many, many years. And it didn't seem to me like cannabis had gone through this process. In fact, what you seem to be talking about are cannabis-based products, which are products from the cannabis plant, but haven't gone through this quality, safety and efficacy process, or their benefit risk profile hadn't been formally evaluated by regulatory authorities. Now, of course, there are some conditions such as early onset epilepsy, two syndromes in particular, Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, where cannabidiol, a component of the cannabis plant, has been investigated in this way that I mentioned about being a medicine and is a cannabis-based medicine, but these are very few and far between. And then there's this fallacy that because and something is a plant, it's naturally good for you. Many natural chemicals are actually harmful and poisonous. So that is a bit simplistic to think that just because cannabis is a plant, it's necessarily good for you. And in Ireland, we've come late to this field. In 2017, our government approved use of cannabis-based products for 3 conditions: multiple sclerosis, vomiting associated with chemotherapy, and severe, as I mentioned, the treatment-resistant epilepsy. And then we come to the issue of pain, because this seems to be the most prominent use of cannabis as a medical so-called medicine in many countries in the world. And I suppose this is a very important thing to establish: is cannabis an effective treatment for pain? And the evidence, initially I thought the evidence was mixed, so I began looking at the evidence for this and reading many of the systematic reviews that have been carried out, which are reviews of studies in the area. And this is a study that's recently been, in 2019, this is a scoping review of systematic studies. So this particular paper is well worth reading, and it looks at 72 systematic reviews. So it reviews, if you like. It takes all the evidence that has been available so far. And when you look at the conclusions, it's showing inconsistent results for systematic reviews of cannabis-based medicine compared to placebo for chronic neuropathic pain and other types of pain. And the authors conclude that cannabis was not superior to placebo in reducing cancer pain. And then, so they've concluded that there's an inability to draw conclusions due to inconsistent findings, lack of rigorous evidence, and they conclude by saying that in fact the harms of cannabis-based medicine may actually outweigh benefits in terms of the adverse effects of the cannabis product itself. So that is quite a eye-opening paper when you consider that many people who are using cannabis for so-called medical reasons are using it for pain. And in fact, you know, we're all very aware, well, we'll be going through some of these, the adverse effects that I mentioned, the adverse effects of THC are quite considerable. And psychosis, depression, anxiety, suicidal behaviours, dependence and cognitive impairment. I'll deal with all these later in the talk, but you're talking about something that has very, very weak evidence for benefits and quite strong evidence for harms. So this is the first poll. Laura, perhaps you could do number 1, please.
Okay, absolutely. Let's launch a poll and ask, is there a public health benefit in legalizing marijuana? If you would please click on your opinion, yes, no, or not sure. If you'll click there, we will give you just a couple seconds to answer, and then I will read off the results. All right, let's close this and see what we see. Okay, Mary, not one person answered yes. 86% said no, and 14% said not sure.
Okay, that's very interesting. So maybe I should just stop talking.
No, this is wonderful. I think that you're convincing them.
Yes, well, let's have a look. And I suppose the only way is really to do, if this is a certain scientific question, you want to answer it scientifically, you look at a place that has legalized cannabis and see, have there been public health benefits? And you know, Colorado is the state that has been most studied in this regard. It was, I think, the earliest state to commercialize cannabis. And in 2014, and let's look, but after, as you can see, though, a long period of the medicinal use of cannabis, so it was quite freely available for many years. And this is a report on cannabis in Colorado, and let's look. So this is rate of hospitalizations with possible related to cannabis. That has increased. We have fatal crashes involving cannabis impaired drivers. That has increased. We have this is poisonings in relation to cannabis or cannabis products. That has increased. Cannabis poisonings in children have increased. Cannabis-related ED visits have increased. This is all over the period spanning from the pre and post commercialization of cannabis. And also, as you can see, though, a lot of this is the kind of the increases that we're seeing also encompass that period where there was so-called the medical cannabis was being very freely available. This is extremely concerning. This is cannabis and suicide, and you're finding that rates of suicide that have cannabis present in the toxicology have increased quite dramatically, actually over recent years. This is from Texas, actually, and I just want to show this because this I think is an extremely concerning slide, showing that these are substance abuse figures for perpetrators of child maltreatment, and you can see, I mean, it really is quite startling that cannabis is the #1 product that is found to be abused by people who have been investigated by child maltreatment organizations, higher than alcohol. Okay. So I think your listeners are right, Laura, that we don't see many benefits from legalizing cannabis in terms of public health. But are there other social justice benefits from legalizing cannabis? I mean, these were the great arguments to legalize cannabis, that it would eliminate the black market, it would reduce racial inequity in arrests and imprisonment, it would reduce deaths from overdoses, and give more revenue for the public services. So these were the arguments, I think, put forward, very compelling arguments to legalize cannabis. But let's just have a look at what's happened. I think you will all be aware the black market has not disappeared. This is just one example of the illegal marijuana growing is just as it seems to be just as prevalent as ever. In fact, the police forces in Colorado seem to be busier dealing with cannabis now than they were before it was legalized. I've seen various reports of that. This is the issue of racial disparities in arrests. They persist even in states that have legalized or decriminalized marijuana. I actually got this figure from a report by a pro-cannabis group, the American Civil Liberties Union, and even though they report that legalization hasn't changed these disparities, they still recommend proceeding with legalizing marijuana use and possession. These are drug overdose deaths in Colorado. This is a very striking graph showing seem to be no beneficial change from legalizing cannabis. And the economic costs, this is something that isn't often thought about. And some people have started to study this, and one group have shown from Colorado Christian University have shown that for every dollar gained in tax revenue, Coloradans spent approximately $4 or $50 to mitigate the effects of legalization. And they say this could even be a conservative estimate. And many of the costs are due to hospitalizations and emergency room attendance, but also school dropout, and something we'll talk about later. Okay, so it doesn't seem like the social justice aims have been really dramatically fulfilled so far, anyway. And we need to start asking for evidence for these claims that are being made. This is another claim that's made, that we're losing the war on drugs. And now, I don't know, just being from Ireland, I just wanted to point out that this is a figure for opioid use disorder among adolescents, and we've actually done very well over since the 1990s until until 2014. We're doing very well, really, in terms of dealing with this problem in adolescence, in Ireland at least. It may be different. And this was a cannabis use. This is the SPAD study, which is a large study of school children over Europe. And you can see the green line there is Ireland. And we actually had made great progress in reducing past month cannabis use among our adolescents until about 2011, when things started to go up again. And now the situation is not great in Ireland. Cannabis use is increasing among young people. Cannabis use disorder is increasing. Cannabis is now the #1 reason why young people attend adolescent addiction services. It has surpassed any other product. Okay, this is another myth. I think I'm not sure. This probably corresponds to the poll number 5, I think, Laura.
Okay, let me put that up. This one is, will more cannabis use decrease the use of other substances by teens? So please click on your opinion. Yes, no, or not sure if more cannabis use will decrease the use of other substances by teens. We'll give you a few more seconds to vote on that. We have about 80% who have voted. Okay, let's see what you all say. Oh, Mary, once again, none of them have answered yes. 94% say no, and 6% say not sure.
Okay, great. I think your audience are very, I think they're very well informed. They must be reading all the papers, because when I went to look at this issue, I found overwhelmingly exactly that cannabis does not decrease use of other drugs. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. And there has been this myth for many years that cannabis is not a gateway drug, but in fact this is not borne out by the evidence. And I was particularly interested in evidence from twin studies, because you know, when you look at discordant twins, identical twins, then you're controlling for all the other factors like genetic and environmental factors that may be involved. And so about at least 3 studies have looked at this. They've used this scientific, or this kind of natural experiment, if you like, looking at same-sex twins in whom one has used cannabis in adolescence and the other hasn't, and they invariably find that the twin who's used cannabis in adolescence has greater risk of other drug use than their co-twin who doesn't. And this is later in adulthood. And the risks range from 2 to 5 in some studies, up to even 16-fold in one study. So I say your listeners are well informed on that. Okay. Oh yes, this is another poll, Laura. So I think this is number 2.
All right, let's put that up. If cannabis were legalized, would we see a lower rate of adolescent use? Yes, no, or not sure. If cannabis were legalized, would we see lower rates of adolescent use? I think the way we might have worded these is giving it all away. I should have done some reverse wording on these, Mary. Okay, we have almost everyone voting. Let's see what everyone says. And we had 97% say no and 3% say not sure. I think they know our number here now.
Okay. Okay. Right. As I say, maybe I should just stop talking. Your listeners they've read all the papers, and no. Well, actually, this one is interesting, because there have been some papers coming out recently, and you probably are aware of that. There was a paper in 2019 from Anderson et al., and that was published as a letter in JAMA Pediatrics, and then a paper this year from Coley et al., and they looked at the youth risk behaviour survey, and the Anderson study now was very short, but it hit the headlines because they appeared to find a decrease in the use of marijuana, or cannabis as I call it, in states that are legalized. Now they compared with the states that had medical marijuana legalization, the MML states, if you like, and which I think is an interesting, which could explain their findings. But they did not. Coley et al. Found no increase. They didn't find a decrease like Anderson did. They used the same survey, this youth risk behaviour survey, but didn't. They had a slightly different analysis. Now, however, the problem with these studies is, that I see it, they didn't include Oregon or Washington, which are, again, like, so Colorado was really the only state that was included that had legalized for some time. And of the 6 states that they included, most of them had only legalized for recreational use about a year earlier. So you weren't really going to see many effects. And again, this issue of comparing the recreational marijuana legalization to those states that had medical marijuana legalization could be a very spurious comparison, as I'll talk about in a minute. Now, another study came out last year, 2020, by Magdalena Cerda et al. And this was using a different survey, a national survey of drug use and health. Now, she had data from Colorado, Oregon, Alaska, and Washington, which have, and she actually found an increase in cannabis use disorder in 12 to 17-year-olds post recreational marijuana legalization, a 25% increase. Now, when you think of what cannabis use disorder is, this is addiction to cannabis. This is dependence on cannabis. This is very, very serious. And a 25% increase is extremely concerning. But what I found slightly baffling was that in her conclusions, she said that the study's findings suggest that although marijuana legalization advanced social justice goals, and as we've just discussed, there actually is very little evidence for that. The small post-RML increase in risk for cannabis use disorder among respondents are a potential public health concern. Yes, I would agree with that. That is definitely a public health concern. And she suggests that the seriousness of the long-term consequences of cannabis use disorder in adolescents suggests the need for additional study. Now, I would suggest it suggests the need for additional action rather than additional studies. So I thought she underplayed her findings quite a bit. Now, just in terms of that, as you can see, so I can understand people may be confused when studies are finding different things, but sometimes you just have to take a really straightforward look at things. And this is a list of countries. I got this from the SAMHSA website, and they've listed all the states in terms of from highest to lowest prevalence of use in 3 different age groups, 12 to 17, 18 to 25, and then 26 and over. And the red states are the ones who've legalized for recreational use, the green states for medical use, and then the white states have neither. Now, I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to see that the red and green states are all at the top of the list. They have the highest prevalences. So if you're comparing the reds to the greens, you're not going to find much of a difference because you've already had that long period where cannabis is becoming acceptable as a so-called medicine. And as Laura mentioned in her talk, that people can get cannabis from age 18 with a medical card search. So sometimes you don't have to complicate things too much in terms of statistics. Okay, and what's really worrying is, as Cerda found in her study, it's the heavy users are using even more. So what's happening post legalization, you can see in this graph that young people who use 22 days or more out of 30 days, that's pretty much daily use. That has gone up since legalization. So to quite an alarming degree. And these are the group that have the concentration of the most harms. This is again a very dramatic finding. This is cannabis use disorders in a graphic form. The prevalence in various states in the US and also in Canada. And this is in up 10 to 24 years old, data from 2019. You can see the red states are the ones with the highest levels of cannabis use disorder. Now, you can see Canada is not doing well, and my US geography is not great. I'm sure you'll all recognize which states are the ones that have the red bars. But let's look at how, so the US in general is not doing great compared with the rest of the world. So the darker the blue, the lower your rates of cannabis use disorder in adolescents. And so you can see that really, the US and Canada are out ahead of the rest of the world on this particular measure. So if the rest of the world is looking to, emulate some country in terms of, public health and adolescent welfare, I certainly don't think they should be looking to Canada or the United States for an example in this regard. So, and as I mentioned, it's not just the use is increasing, it's the potency is increasing, which is also increasing the risk of cannabis dependence because the THC is the component that will induce dependence. Okay, I think this is, Laura, I think this is poll number 6, probably.
All right, let's put that up. Are alcohol and tobacco more harmful to young people than cannabis? What do you think here? Yes, no, or not sure? And by the way, Mary, we got a comment from someone listening that we need the facts so that we can pass it on to others. So although many on this call are highly educated on this topic, we need to know this data so that we can refute it with people who believe they know more about this and even have fake news, so to speak. Okay, let's pause this poll and we'll see what the answers are. Here we have some mixed reviews. 6% said yes, alcohol and tobacco are more harmful. 74% said no, and 21% said not sure.
Okay, that's very interesting. I suppose we should have, maybe in the end, I might suggest some way we could possibly have reworded this question to make it maybe more clear for people. I mean, I'm not in any way saying that tobacco and alcohol are, harmless substances, but it's frequently used as an argument that these are legal and why can't cannabis be legal too? So let's look at the outcomes. This is well known, and there's a huge literature on socioeconomic outcomes following adolescent cannabis use. So we're finding increased rates of school dropout, poor educational outcomes, occupational outcomes, increased welfare usage, lower socioeconomic group, people drop, poor relationship satisfaction, financial difficulties, traffic offences, less likely to graduate from high school and less likely to graduate from college. So these are all known, and there's a large literature on this. Now, but as people say, well, wouldn't it be the same for alcohol use in adolescence? So maybe cannabis is no worse. But these studies, this is one of the first studies to look at this issue. This is for Bowden and Ferguson from the Christchurch study in New Zealand, and they looked at this issue. Sorry, my light's just gone off. And they found that when they controlled, so what most people do is they control for alcohol use, and they still find this range of outcomes is present, even when you take account of alcohol use. So over and above alcohol use in adolescence, you're still getting these very highly significant, you can see there in the abstract, highly significant outcomes, poor outcomes in adulthood. This is a study that directly, again, Magdalene and Serda, this study from the Dunedin cohort directly addresses this issue. And what they find is that alcohol dependence is associated with adverse outcomes, but when they take account of alcohol use and take people out of alcohol from the equation, they find they still have significant adverse outcomes for those who use dependence. And in fact, when they directly compare the two, they find that the people who use cannabis in adolescence have more financial difficulties in adulthood than those who were dependent on alcohol, which is as a very serious alcohol. So you can see with the figure there, the yellow bars are excluding those. They've taken out anyone from the study who has persistent alcohol or other drug dependence, and you're still finding, you see the increased rates of financial difficulties. Now the diagnosis here is this is over the course of the study, whether they've had a diagnosis of cannabis use disorder at 1 point, 2 points or 3 points over the course of this follow-up, which is I think till age 38. So you can see that the more persistent your alcohol use, the worse that your outcomes. And you can see a very significant change in social class from childhood to adolescence in people, which is again dose respondent effect. And even you can see the yellow bar there, when they take out people who are dependent on alcohol or have had alcohol problems, they're still finding this effect. And then George Patton, again, very highly thought of Australian researcher, has shown that you can see his conclusions there, that what he found actually was that those who use cannabis, used to use alcohol in adolescence, and those, if we're comparing those who use cannabis and those who use alcohol in adolescence, the cannabis users are more likely to continue with their cannabis use selectively than the alcohol users. And then this is another study from Sillins et al., again looking at outcomes of adolescent cannabis use. Sorry, this you might be able to read the things there. It's a very interesting paper. And so the column on the left is looking at cannabis use, and then the column on the right is where they adjust for alcohol use. And you can see high school completion, it's in relation to how often they use cannabis, whether it's less than monthly, weekly, or daily. You can see these dose response effects for problems with high school completion. You can see below the line, which means they're less likely to complete school. Look across to the other column, even when they adjust for alcohol, that hardly makes any difference to that high school completion statistic. Degree attainment is again affected in a dose response way by cannabis use. It makes no difference when you adjust for alcohol. Cannabis dependence again is increased. Use of other drugs, increased suicide attempts. That's the fourth one down there. You can see that increases, and again there's no depending on your level of cannabis use, and again no difference when you adjust for alcohol. The only thing that seems to make a difference for adjusting for alcohol is rate of depression, which and welfare dependence, which become less significant. But all the others are still very significant, even when you control for alcohol use. So it seems to me that cannabis is driving worse outcomes for adolescent use than alcohol in adolescence. And this is a natural experiment which was done in the Netherlands. It was a very interesting study. So for a period in Maastricht in, I think it was 2012, the coffee shops were shut to people who weren't Dutch, Belgian, or German. So they would not let the French or Luxembourgian or other nationalities into the coffee shops. I think they'd been concerned about cannabis tourism. So this affected students. So they were looking at students in an international business school in Maastricht. And you can see from the graph that the students with the red line, they're the ones who were locked out of the coffee shops, if you like, for their period. And you can see how much better their educational attainment was, how much better their grades were during that period where they weren't allowed into the coffee shops compared to the students who were. And this is probably, so this is just purely the cannabis. It's like a natural experiment again. They were obviously maybe using other substances, but they could see a significant effect just for that period. Okay, now this is a study that actually just came out this week in my own group in Ireland, and has got some media interest here, looking at IQ decline following frequent or dependent cannabis use in youth. This is a systematic review where we looked at 7 longitudinal studies, and what we wanted to do is get studies that had IQ, a baseline IQ measure before young people started using cannabis, and then an IQ measure that was taken at some point after they started using cannabis. And we pooled together all the data from these studies, giving a total of 800 young people with baseline measures before and after they used cannabis, and then 5,000 young people who never used. So we had baseline and follow-up measures on them, but they had never used cannabis. And what you could see was that, this is the plot here, you can see that in all the cases, the full-scale IQ there at the top, there is a decline in IQ in young people who use cannabis compared to those who didn't during adolescence. And the pooled total corresponded to a decline in 2 IQ points. And when you put this in context, this is the kind of IQ decline that you expect for people who have been exposed to lead in early childhood or in infancy. And you can see we get very concerned about lead exposure, and yet young people using cannabis are being exposed to the same levels of risk to their IQ, and particularly their verbal IQ. And the study that followed them up the longest, most of these studies just followed up to about age 18, but this study, again from Dunedin study, followed up to age 38, showing an 8-point decline in those who had persistent cannabis use right into adulthood. Okay, so this I think would correspond to poll number 4, I think our last one, Laura.
All right. Let's put that up here. Let's see, on medicine, does cannabis act like medicine and reduce mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety in young people? What is your answer there? And by the way, Mary, this group of Johnny's ambassadors, I think someone commented, of course, that we are most likely, certainly more educated on this topic than most, that if you were giving this at a town hall or a community meeting, certainly you would not get these results in these polls. So
true.
let's close this one and share. And 5% said yes, it can act like medicine. 92% say no, and 3% say not sure.
Okay, great. Well, I totally agree with your listener there. Actually, you would be, I suppose, called a selected sample of the listeners, but hopefully, as you say, it'll give you some arguments to take away to use for others, because these are very, very well established myths, if you like, in public perception. So this is a study, just to answer this question. Let's look at cannabis use in adolescents and risk of depression and anxiety. You're probably aware the study's been very influential. A systematic review by Gabriella Gobbi, and she looked at, again, systematic reviews are the highest form of evidence, and she found, you can see there, it's the opposite to the graph I showed you a minute ago, where the IQ was on the left-hand side, so everything was lower. This time it's on the right-hand side. So all the studies that she examined looking at cannabis use and later depression are on the right-hand side, showing an increase in depression in young cannabis users. And she found a 40% increase. And then what is even more concerning, and I found this a very startling finding, she looked at suicide ideation and suicide attempts, finding again a 50% increased risk in suicide ideation in young people who use cannabis, and a 3.5-fold, more than threefold increase of suicide attempts in young people who use cannabis. Now this I think is an incredibly concerning finding. And you know, we put so much effort into suicide prevention, and yet this substance that appears to increase suicide risk in young people is widely available and it appears to be viewed as harmless by many people. And a very recent study that has just come out in the last month or so shows that among young people who have depression, cannabis is particularly harmful because it increases their risk of self-harm, again by a factor of about threefold, and increases their risk of all-cause mortality. So if young people who already have a mood disorder and they take cannabis, compared to those who have mood disorder and don't use cannabis, and their risks of dying are higher. Again, this is incredibly concerning. Now, and what is really, I suppose, the problem is that cannabis is a young person's drug. So it seems to be particularly, that's why we're very concerned about its use in young people, because the brain is still developing. And, you know, this IQ effect, how there are a lot of studies showing that cannabis, particularly the THC component, can disrupt normal brain development. And I know you have other studies, you have other talks on that topic, and I won't get into that here, but it's something we definitely need to be looking at more. And your Surgeon General, I really admired this man actually in terms of his focus on cannabis. He made a very clear statement: no amount of cannabis is safe for the developing brain. So I suppose what a takeaway message I'd like you to have is that, you know, that we talked a bit about alcohol, not so much about tobacco, but alcohol is very harmful to the liver. I mean, no one will deny that. And we can see rates of cirrhosis in adulthood, and it's a terrible illness. So alcohol is very damaging to your liver. Tobacco, as we all know, very damaging to your heart and to your lungs. But cannabis does appear to have a particularly damaging effect on the developing brain. And USA and Canada, as Robin Murray said, have embarked on a major pharmaceutical experiment with the brains of their youth, you know, because they have legalized this substance. And he said we should wait and see the outcome. But, you know, that means you have to quite measure it, and then you have to act if things are not going the way they should be. If the evidence is showing harms, then some action should be taken. So I suppose just finishing up, I was curious as to where all the myths come from in terms of cannabis. And I don't think it's an accident that many people believe cannabis is harmless and that they doubt the science that is there, because this is a long-standing tactic from the tobacco industry and the alcohol industry that have now been adopted, I think, by the cannabis industry. And there's some really fascinating books and papers on this topic, and I think it's well worth a read, because, you know, as that book by Michael said, doubt is our product, and they actually try and, you know, the evidence for harms of cannabis use is, in my view, overwhelming. But yet, in the minds of the public, there is a doubt about it because it's been carefully planted there. And it's important to be be very, very clear. And I think, you know, that's why your listeners, I really admire the fact that they want to get the facts and try and counteract these myths and doubts that have been sowed. And as we all know, it's very well-funded organisations promoting the use of cannabis. And there's conflicts of interest in some scientists that have been looking at this issue who actually have made money themselves from cannabis industry. So there's no poll on this one, but I don't want you to come away feeling very depressed that there's nothing you can do, because sometimes you feel that it's inevitable, and that's the message we're getting in Europe, is that it's inevitable that cannabis will be legalized. So I want to tell you a little story just to finish up about Ireland, about the Headshops. That back in 2010, Headshops were open, and they sold all kinds of products that they got around the law, because there wasn't a law specifically dealing with these products, because they were very new, and they were able to sell them openly. And the number of head shops increased in Ireland quite dramatically from 2008 up to about 2010. And then the harms began to happen. Young people began to die. Coroners began to have warnings about these things. And journalists began to get worried, the doctors began to get worried about this. We were seeing increases in psychosis and psychotic illnesses coming into the emergency departments and the inpatient units. It began to get mentioned in the newspapers. And most importantly, and I think particularly for your audience, parents began to get worried, and parents began to picket these shops and began to get organised and speak out. And the politicians then began to notice. And then a number of times it was mentioned in our Dáil, which is our parliament, increased. And then the government acted. And our Minister for Justice brought in 2 laws very close together within the space of 6 months, clamping down on these head shops. And this is a paper by Bobby Smith, who I think is going to be giving a talk to you, showing a dramatic, once that this was enacted, you got a dramatic decrease in the number of head shops, but also in the number of admissions and the number of treatments for these substance use problems in young people. You can see the graph. So that's quite a dramatic effect. And then Bobby has written this up as a paper, which is due to be published quite soon. And very similar to the way we save lives with road traffic accidents. So things like seatbelts work, breath tests work, and lowering the blood alcohol concentration actually works and helps to save lives. So legislation can be life-saving in these cases. And so another positive thing is celebrities are beginning to speak out. This is Stormzy, a rapper, who has come out very clearly saying, if you've got mental health problems, stop smoking weed. It's not good for your mental health. And but there's a long way to go, and I think your listeners will all be very aware that the public opinion is very much for pro cannabis, and as Abraham Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. With it nothing can fail, and against it nothing can succeed. So there's a long road ahead, but I think we need to stick with the evidence and stick with the facts and stay strong. Thank you.
Mary, this is shocking, overwhelming, and at the same time, I think reassuring to all of the parents who are on here, because sometimes we just feel we are fighting an uphill battle, and we are getting organized, and that is exactly what Johnny's Ambassadors is doing. Just like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, we are getting organized. We have our first large-scale Stop Dabbing Walk in September for Suicide Prevention Month. And so I will keep you posted on our progress, as I hope you will keep us posted on yours. We do have a few questions in just a few minutes. I would love to ask some questions of you. Let's see. In your work on suicide risk, do you believe that cannabis exerts a direct effect, or is it indirect through the psychotic disorders it triggers?
Do you know, that's a really good question, and I don't have an answer to that, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, I think it's something we do need to study. It's actually been, this link with suicidal behaviours is quite recent and quite, as I say, dramatic. So I think we need to, I think the answer is probably both. I think there would be an effect through psychosis. And as you know, THC is an incredibly potent inducer of psychosis, but there could be other effects as well. So that's a really good question. I think it's an area we really need to study.
Okay. Is there a difference in early onset of schizophrenia between males and females?
There is, yes. It's more likely in males. In fact, schizophrenia in general is more likely in males, but particularly the early onset type, yes.
Okay. What percentage of people who develop psychosis would not have if they didn't use cannabis, or would it just not be as bad?
Well, do you remember I mentioned this population attributable fraction? The statistics. It's a kind of it's like a thought experiment you can do with certain kinds of study if you have a certain type of data, and you know what they're showing in that in areas that have very high levels of high potency cannabis use, that you could, like London or Amsterdam, you could possibly abolish 30 to 50% of the psychosis or schizophrenia illnesses in these areas if you could eliminate high potency cannabis from the population. So that is a very worthwhile goal, and there is no environmental, as I say, risk factor that comes close to high potency cannabis when it comes to psychosis at the moment.
It's shocking.
Mm.
It's just shocking. Based on all the governments, or based on all of this that you've mentioned, why are governments then continuing to push for legalization? Are they not aware of this? What is their argument? If they were listening to all this, how do they continue to justify legalization? That's a mystery. Money.
It's not. Yes, it is a great question, and I think that is the key question. What is going on at the level of government? And my suspicion is that you've got very, very well-funded lobbyists who are constantly have the ear of our legislators. It's happening all over because it's you know, in Ireland we're a good bit behind you, but it's already starting. And you know, as soon as someone gets into a position of power, they are a target for these groups, and they hear one side of the story all the time, the same story all the time, and no one seems to think to ask for evidence for these benefits of cannabis legalization for some reason. And we get glossy brochures, and you get people whose job is full-time to lobby. And you know, people like you, Laura, or you know, myself, you know, we have other jobs, and you can't compete with that level of access. But you know, as I showed from the Headshop example, politicians ultimately do have to listen to their public. And if they think the public is turning on this issue, they will have to listen.
Is that because your constituents, I mean, the public is just more educated there in Ireland on this topic?
I think, yes, that's a good point. I suppose in smaller countries, it's easier. People are more cohesive. I'm not saying that we're immune to this in any way. We're seeing a lot of positive messaging and normalization of cannabis use in this country, and but I suppose the medical profession has a job to do as well. I mean, we can stand up and say there are harms here, you know, and we need to point them out. Sometimes doctors and other health professionals tend to just wait for the evidence to answer those questions, and the people can figure out they can go read the studies for themselves and look it up. It doesn't work like that. You have to get out there and promote your findings. You know, Richard Dahl, who was the doctor who discovered the link between tobacco and breast cancer, he studied that for decades, and he did huge studies, and I think they were so obvious to him that I don't think he felt he had to get out and promote the findings until it was too late. And then by that stage, the tobacco industry had already started their campaign of sowing doubts, and, you know, just a little bit of doubt in the minds of the public and the minds of politicians. That's all you need. And just to say, well, the evidence isn't conclusive, but, you know, and demand an unacceptable level of proof for anything, where in fact, you know, you know, just when I was doing the reading for this talk and from other talks I've done, I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of evidence for the cannabis harms, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm just, you know, like your listener, your questioner there, I'm just saying, how can this happen? But we have to just make it easy for people to get this information.
And so,
you know,
final, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, yeah.
No, a final question, and then any that are not answered, I will send to you in email, but they are tied together. In 2020, Canadian cannabis survey indicated that around 70% of adolescent users ages 16 through 24 know that it can cause mental illness, but they still use. Nearly 90% know it's more dangerous to youth than adults, but they still use. Someone else said, why do you think American psychiatry has been so behind European psychiatry in this regard, i.e. accepting the impact that cannabis has on marijuana? How do we combat this?
I can't answer for the issue with American psychiatry. I don't know. It's a very interesting question. The issue that your listener mentioned there of young people knowing the risks and still going ahead with taking the substance or smoking is really interesting. And I think it comes back to the issue of young people. First, there's two things. One is they feel they're immortal. You know, you feel this isn't going to get me. And also they feel it won't apply to them. And so young people, they're really interesting. They're always looking for, but you won't develop psychosis unless you have a family history. Like, no, actually, you know, they've done studies where, you know, they've given IV THC, and 70% of people develop psychotic symptoms within 30 minutes. You know, everyone is susceptible to this, and yet, but yet, just that little bit of doubt. No, it's not going to be me. You know, and young people are always looking for an angle. You know, they're always, so if you're presenting to them, they'll see the one they'll say, but 3 people didn't get, you know, psychosis, or this many people didn't get depressed, but they ignore the ones that did because they think they're going to fall into that category. It's just this human mind is the way it works, and you know, we have to learn to have a very clear message and try and get around these, like, but, you know, or what ifs, and say, well, actually, no, let's face facts here. This is not good for you. Yeah.
Professor Mary Cannon, this has been an incredibly eye-opening and enlightening session. I love your fast talking because you were able to get in a ton of data and information that this audience, I know, of Johnny's Ambassadors will be able to go out and shout it from the rooftops and speak loudly and in one voice about the harms of marijuana on our youth. And you have contributed greatly to our cause, and we so appreciate your time, the talent, and just everything that it took to bring this presentation to us today. Mary, thank you for being one of Johnny's Ambassadors.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all. We'll see you again in another webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.